So welcome back. We're looking forward to continue today where we left off last week, page 214 in the Geras HaKodesh of the Alter Rebbe. But 5 lines from the top, it's a new paragraph. So if you recall from last week, we spoke about the phenomenon of Abba Yosad Barato. Literally translated, the father establishes or erects the daughter, and so besides the simple idea of parents being the children are a product of parents, but the connection per se to the Abba Yosad Barato, father establishing, erecting the daughter. So it was a concept which the Alter Rebbe presented in this part of the Geras HaKodesh, and which of course Alter Rebbe is going to take it further as we left off last week. Alter Rebbe is going to take it further and explain why he's elaborating on this Abba Yosad Barato and what's the connection to this epistle, Geras HaKodesh, which is based on Kibiko Hashem Tzuri Lomim, Hashem creating the worlds, plural, Eilam Haba and Eilam Hazeh, Eilam Haba with the Yud and Eilam Hazeh with the Hey. Now there's a whole phenomenon of Eilam Haba, all levels of Eilam Haba, Ganei Natacht and Ganei Na'el, the myriads of different levels of Gan Eden. This is Ein Sof levels within Gan Eden itself. It's brought down a number of places. It says, which is part of the idea. We say there's Ein Sof Eilamis to that degree, but Gan Eden, there's many levels of Gan Eden. Yilchu Mechayil El Choil, the whole phenomenon of Gan Eden was created with a Yud of Hashem, because one Yud, one letter of Hashem. The whole Eilam Hazeh was created with a Hey. And that's why it doesn't say Hashem created Tzuri Lamim, the whole Yiko Hashem Tzuri Lamim. The whole, all the worlds, Eilam Hazeh and Eilam Haba, in its entirety was created with the 2 letters of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Yud to Eilam Haba and Hey to Eilam Hazeh. So Alter Rebbe, if you recall, explained the Yud, the Eilam Haba, the association and the connection with Eilam Haba, with the letter Yud of Hashem. And now the Alter Rebbe is going to go into this Hey, which is this world, Eilam Hazeh, was created with. So he elaborates on this Barato, on this energy of the Hey, which are the Isis, which are the letters, and their connection to the Yud. In other words, the very first part of Seder Ishtalshel is the Chochmah, as we know, we mentioned so many times. The Hey is the lowest, which is the Dibur, the Isis, the letters. The Alter Rebbe makes the connection. Abba Yosad Barato. And what's the explanation? So last week's pretty much the entire class explaining the Abba Yosad Barato. What does that mean? How does it manifest in man's development or in the function of the human being? And Alter Rebbe lays this out so perfectly, so eloquently. And the point is that which Alter Rebbe is going to, in today's class, take that analogy of Abba Yosad Barato and explain it and ultimately connect it to the Hey creating Eilam Hazeh. The Hey is evident because Alter Rebbe is speaking about that Hey. Abba Yosad Barato. Barato is the Malchus, the Hey Tato, right? In Hashem's holy name, there's the Yud K Vav K. The Hey, the lower Hey, is the Dibur. Malchuscha Malchus Kol. A king leads and guides and succeeds with his kingship over his people by Dibur, as many psukim says, his edicts, his decrees, and so on. This is the Dibur of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which establishes the Malchus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Malchuscha becomes Malchus Kol Olam, and because there is an expansion in Malchus, similar to the expansion of Dibur, many letters, many words. This is the energy of all the multiplicity, ultimately, which we find in Eilam Hazeh, this physical world, which is all about multiplicity, for that matter, lacking a lot of the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's the mandate of the Yid, to introduce Emes Hashem La'olam, the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, as Lashon Uzayr, to take Ereshus HaRabim, a domain of the Rabim, which is of the multitude, and divisiveness, anything other than the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, anything other than the demonstration of the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and transform it to a Reshus HaYachid, to Yechidish Elam, to transform it to a domain which demonstrates the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that is through learning Torah and doing mitzvahs. And again, we accomplished it over the thousands of years, and we're entering into Yemei HaMashiach at this time, where the world calls and demonstrates more and more the Achdus Hashem, the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And when you see today that maybe sometimes the message is opposite to the contrary, now we see clearly what a life without Achdus Hashem, to what degree, to what nadir levels it could plummet and fall to. So for that matter, a lot of stuff we see today we didn't see in the past. To the contrary, it's a revelation, it's a discovery that one does not live with the message of Achdus Hashem, the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, not only the Yid, the non-Yid, the world in general, those who live the oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, live a better life, live a more meaningful life, as opposed to those who don't and try to relegate, and from relegating that message to negating that message. In the end of the day, the inevitability of falling and plummeting low is again very evident. So this is V'hoya Hashem Melech HaKol Ha'aretz V'emuyi Hashem Echad U'Shmei Echad. The oneness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is going to manifest in Elam Haza one day. But Elam Haza on its own, you see right away the correlation to Hey, the multiplicity and the multitude of letters which ultimately become the source of creation of this world, Elam Haza, which is lacking that oneness. So I'm a little jumping over here, but the Alter Rebbe in the Abba Yosef Brata establishes that in the end of the day, this Brata, this Hey, which is the Malchus, is always connected to the highest level, to the Chokhmah, to the core, to the most soulful strands of the Nefesh. Again, as he saw it in last week's class. So, of course, we're not going to go over this whole explanation and presentation of the Alter Rebbe Abba Yosef Brata. That's why in other words, today we're continuing to see the last week's class. It's literally a click away. As we mentioned many times, wherever you're watching this class, there is an advantage of the original website, tanyaonline.com, where you have all the previous classes from the very beginning. As we mentioned, we merited to conclude the Likutei Amorim, Shaykh B'Muni, Igeres HaTshuva, and now Igeres HaKodesh. We did mention the distinction of Igeres HaKodesh over the previous segments. Each letter is a separate letter. There's no sequential connection between one Igeres and another, even though you do find, mentioned many times, because there's something very, very powerful. Someone comes out from the Igeres HaKodesh, of the Igeres HaKodesh, of learning and studying the Igeres HaKodesh, additional, of course, to the message of every letter, every epistle on its own. There is a thread, for example, we mentioned many times, the message of Tzedakah, the Alter Rebbe's inimitable explanation and capturing and presenting, and which is basically a revolutionary, if you will, a revolutionary understanding and appreciation and presentation of the mitzvah tzedakah as an example, which is definitely a thread throughout the Igeres HaKodesh. At the end of the day, the Alter Rebbe, even in this Igeres, Alter Rebbe is definitely going to come to the same message of tzedakah, but what a beautiful presentation before, a lengthier chapter. But the Alter Rebbe begins with Vayaz David Shem, as we began 2 weeks ago. David made himself a name. There's the Pirush HaPoshet, and as Alter Rebbe, from that Shem, Alter Rebbe goes into Vayaz David Shem, and the Zayir, which the Alter Rebbe brings, that this is Reb Shimon says, whoever wants to erect Hashem's name, is who is the one who erects Hashem's name, the one who gives tzedakah, the miskin, and tzedakah to the poor. And with this, the Alter Rebbe goes into the Ko Hashem Tzurei Lamim, explaining the correlation and the connection between Elam Haba to the Yud and Elam Hazeh to the Hey. So the Alter Rebbe begins the Abba Yosef Brata, and basically the message that the ability of a human being to talk is not because he has those instruments. If we use the terminology instruments just to appreciate the matter a bit more, the Hey Motzei Sapeh, the place where the letters actually come from, which is the throat, the lips, the tongue, the gums, and the teeth. That's where the letters take formation, but that's not the reason and the basis for the human being's ability to talk. as we mentioned, an example, just to repeat that example, a mute person, again, everybody should be gesund and stark, and healthy and strong, completely healthy with all their faculties. But a mute person, they have all the instruments, the hemesis apeh, but you see they struggle to say even a word. And sometimes because they have a desire to talk, but they start with their instruments, and it's as we mentioned the other week, it's something that's painful to watch because there's a compromise, there's a fragmentation in their abba, in the chokhmah, in the core of the nefesh, which ultimately is the source of the gift of talking, the gift of speech. Vayi ha'adam lenefesh chaya, says the Targum, l'ruach memalala. This is the advantage and the uniqueness of man over all creation, even over animal, which again lives and functions and maneuvers and so on. That he has the ability to communicate, the power of speech, the koyach, the gift of speech, that was given uniquely to the human being, but not because he has those 5 instruments. It's because he has a healthy nefesh. I'm not talking about godly soul. He has a healthy chokhmah, he has a healthy core, and therefore he's able to talk. As Dr. points out, when a person talks, you don't even focus at all, for that matter, on the hemetzes apeh, on these instruments. No one turns their lips or their tongue in a certain way, but when they want to pronounce something to the contrary, you want to say something, all the instruments follow suit. They fall right into place because you want to talk. It's something deep. It's a nafshizdik experience. Again, we learned this last week. Why are we repeating it? I'm not sure. But what Alter Rebbe is saying, so this is Abba Yosa Brato, which is in the end. So before the Alter Rebbe, so the Alter Rebbe comes today, in today's class it says, make no mistake, we did mention it last week, of course you need these 5 instruments in order to pronounce the word. We mentioned last week someone's tongue is hurting, let's say you hear the lamed is compromised, their ability to pronounce the lamed as an example, which the lamed, the L comes from the tongue, need not to explain. And if someone's chas v'sholem, his tongue is bruised, you can hear that he has a problem saying the lamed. Or someone who has chopped lips, for example, it's difficult, you hear the difference in that mem, or beis, or vav, or pei, as the Alter Rebbe mentioned last week, the beis vav mem pei coming from the lips. If someone has chopped lips, of course you hear the difference. And so too the other instruments, if there's a compromise and there's a fragmentation one way or another, even the slightest, in these 5 instruments, you see the difference in the pronunciation of the words. So of course they play a role in the structured speech, the structured wording, the emerging of the words, of the letters, and so on and so forth, and the sentences. Of course they do. Alter Rebbe was saying, where does it begin? Where does it commence? Where does it initiate? It initiates from the fact that the person's a nefesh chaya, ruach mamali, has a healthy nefesh. And consequently, and again, what Alter Rebbe points out very starkly, he says you find it by the vowels as an example there, you can see it even more stark, basically, when a person wants to say komatz, he doesn't think that he's going to move his lips in a certain way. He wants to say komatz, so consequently it's happening. Pasach, his lips move horizontally, automatically, because you don't focus on the instruments. Yet the Alter Rebbe is going to say, in the end of the day, this is what the Alter Rebbe begins today's class, Acho Eisius, of course the Eisius come from the actual formation of the letters, are directly connected to the 5 instruments. Understandably so. However, there's the chitzenius of the Eisius and the pnimius of the Eisius. The ability to talk, the whole motor, which establishes the whole phenomenon of speech by the human being, comes from the nefesh, comes from the chacham nefesh. It's the Abba which is Yasad Brata, not the areas with Meitzes Apeh. However, the chitzenius, the external, meaning to say the actual structure of the letters themselves, you have the 5 instruments, you have the breath which a person emerges when he talks, the coil, the sound, right? The person's making a decision that there's going to be the sound which, so to say, breaks into the 5 instruments, the Meitzes Apeh, And there you have the actual formation of the letters, which is the chitzeni, is the external, the image itself of the letters. The motor, what makes everything happen, is of course the Abba, which is Yasad Brat, as explained last week. So the Rebbe continues, the letters are form and matter. So there's the matter of the letters, which is the letters itself, which is the chitzenis, the externality of the letters, meaning to say this actual structure of the letter, and then there is the tzura, the image, the inner tzura, which is the pnimis of the letters. It could be also flipped around over here. The chaimer tzura, you see, it says pnimis and chitzenis. Tzura is actually the form. Chaimer, usually it's the matter, what is more the palpable, the more the lower levels, usually the chaimer over the tzura. But maybe over here is the chaimer, meaning to say the ability to talk. The tzura is the image. Either way you look at it, there's the pnimis and chitzenis. Even though, as we learned last week, that the rotzei, that the source rather of all letters come from the kadmus haseichel, that is from the inner core of the seichel, and the rotzin of the nefesh, not the other way around. Not because the person is able to maneuver his instruments, his haymakers up, that's the way he's able to talk. No, the opposite. The source of the letters come from the core of the seichel, mikadmos, the most primordial state of the seichel, which is the chokhmah, the abba, the rotzin, the desire of the nefesh. But that's the tzura. Here, the Alter says clearly the way we said it in the very beginning. The tzura of the image, the creation. That's why it's called tzura. The creation, the creating force, the motor behind these letters come from the kadmus haseichel. They come from the rotzin and nefesh. In other words, from the chokhmah, from the abba. And that changes the pronunciation of one letter to the other of the chabez asius, as we learned last week. However, the physicality, if you will, it's not physical. Understand that it's not physical, but the tangibility, also, if you will, it's not really tangible in its literal sense, but the actual letters, the actual vowels, the actual expression, the actual pronunciation, the actual words, the gufis havuson is the chitzeniuson. There is, of course, the external development of these letters, which is the haveletz me'alev, which is the breath, which comes from the heart. From there you have the voice of the human being, hayetzis mehagorin, which comes from the throat, and then nechel chabez avodes, ubitu chabez asius. From there it's divided to 22 expressions, 22 manners of pronunciation based on the 22 letters, and there the hey meitzis hayedois with the 5 instruments, known 5 instruments, which each one of the 22 letters has their place in these 5 instruments. Last week we spoke about, Alter Rebbe gave the mashal of the lips, which is the beis vav mem pei. Today the Alter Rebbe goes even more. Achaha me'agorin, the aleph, the ches, the hey, and the ayin yes comes from the throat. You don't have to pay too much attention to that. The aleph, ches, hey, ayin, right? And then gichak me'achech, the gimel, the yud, chaf, and kuf is from the gums, and so on. The other again is explained, and the other again with the other 22. The Alter Rebbe said writes, etc. And again you have what the tongue produces, the lips, the teeth, and so on. Who then you have a miftah hevel hey also klila, the les be mishosha, and what really stands behind is the hey. Why the hey? Because the hey is really the basis of all letters. Because the hey is really the breath, if you will, the oxygen or the breath would be more accurate, which every letter is a formation of this which you emerge from yourself when you talk, which is the breath that you invest, which eventually formulates into a sound, into a voice, and that takes formation through the 5 meitzis hapeh, through the 5 instruments of the mouth. So you find the hey very much essential, or very much central, that rather, very much a central part of the whole expression of the actual talking, which is of course the chitzenis, because again the pnimis comes from abo, which is yosad brata, not the other way around. But when you talk about the chitzenis, there's the hey. First of all, you have hey maitzis hapeh, the 5 instruments. That's as well the hey. Every letter really is the hey, which is the breath coming from within, and that takes formation. Also klila lesba mishasha, and for that matter, the hey is the most non-tangible, if you will, type of letter. Again, we're using a terminology just to borrow this terminology to understand that it's the hey, which in the end of the day, all letters are formed from, because that is what you're emerging from yourself when you want to talk. It's the hey, it's that coil, that sound, which eventually that sound will take formation of all the other 22 letters, in other words, which become any of the 22 letters, and they form themselves through these 5 instruments. So again, you have the hey, which is moker chaymer b'kufa esis. This is the source of the body of the letters, of the tangibility of the letters. Again, a borrowed term of the formation, the actual formation of the letters, the body of the letters, terim chalkus and l'chol beis, before they are divided into 22, because that's the coil, the hay, the oxygen or the breath that you invest in the talking. Now we understand the Chazal tells us that this physical world was created with a hay. So the correlation, the connection with the Yud and the Mabah, that's Alter explained earlier. And then he begins the Abba Yosad Brato. And he says the Brato is the hay, which the hay is the reason for any type of talk. Lahabdil, Hashem's talking. And Hashem's talking is what establishes the Malchus of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, similar to a melech, which is Maniga Medina. He leads his country, successful king, through his edicts, through his decrees. The Lashon Melech, can't remember the pasuk, that is through the many psukim in Tanakh, which indicate that a king leads with his speech. Speech is something which is crucial and essential in the leadership of a king. Many psukim in Tanakh, a few of them which probably come back to me shortly, which is brought many times in Chassidus when he speaks about the Malchus, why Malchus is Peh, as the famous Pasuk Leo. And for that matter, you need not to go far also. If you look and you get it, Shashayich Demuna, which we Baruch Hashem concluded, it's a click away with Alter Rebbe speaks about the hey, as it is by a human being. There is the Chachma, the Bina, and then there's the Midas, and then there is the Machshava Dibur Ma'is, the thought, speech, and action. And namely, which is what is centralistic, is of course the speech, what a person emotes with another person, for another person. Compassion is an example. The point is, you tell that poor, that vulnerable, who you're compassionate to, here, take a piece of bread, come in, wash, you stay over, lodge, and so on. Your speech is this which executes this, the sensation of your emotions, or your emotions. If it's kindness, if it's discipline, anyway, it's the speech which ultimately makes it real, and makes it relevant. If you emote towards this poor and vulnerable, and you don't tell them, here, take this loaf of bread, or take a meal, eat the meal, come sleep over, or something similar, it really means nothing. Perhaps not totally nothing. The individual who is experiencing this poverty, as an example, could identify, those who identify with them, but it's just a small percentage if you really want to assist them in the context of identifying rather with them, with their hunger or any type of vulnerability that they have, if you don't put it into words. The words is the last part. The words is this which become the keli, the lavush, the garment to the inner workings of man. For that matter, even the words are a lavush also to one's cognitive faculties. Sometimes you talk out of seichel, you understand something, you perceive something, but you put it into words. It, in the end of the day, contributes and is mashlim, brings a certain completion to this which you perceive with your intellect. When it comes to emotions, you see it more evidently how words are the culminating force which bring out the emotion. The emotion should be meaningful and not meaningless. That's why the dibur, the hey, is the final. The dibur, the hey, the malchus peh, as the lashon in Pasach Eliyahu. And here the Alter Rebbe makes it a clear connection, because hey is the source of all letters, as we just explained. There's the hey maitzes hapeh, and more so, as we're going to see, as the Alter Rebbe points out, that with these 22 letters, there's bli gvul combinations. And again, back to the Sharich of Emunah, the first chapter of Sharich of Emunah, which is also a click away, as the Alter Rebbe points out. This is the reason of the multitude which we find in Elam Hazeh, and our mind still cannot wrap around the grandness and of all creations of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, even in this very physical world. And the reason why there's so many is because there's the combination of all these words. Take, for example, Aleph and Beis. You have already two combinations. Like the combination allowed two words, Av and Ba. 3 Aleph Beis Gimel. You have many more. Not 3. You have more. 4 is way more. Also disproportionate. When you have 5 and 6 and 7, you have 22 letters. And again, how the letters work, the way the configuration of the letters, again, all in Sharich Emunah, this produces the multiplicity, the multitude of creations which we find in Elam Hazeh. So you see the direct connection of the Hey with Elam Hazeh. There's more. But here the Alter Rebbe just mentioned a few. Again, of course, the Hey Meitzes Hapeh, the 5 instruments which produce these letters, and these are the letters, Be'esi, Bidvar Hashem Shemayim Nasu, V'ruach Piv Kol Tzavo, Be'yisor Ma'amoris Niven Ha'elam. The world was created with 10 sayings. It's the talk of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which is the Hey Tato, which creates all of creations in this world. Thus, the Hey Tzurei Lamim, the Hey of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, creates Elam Hazeh. This is what the Gemara says, Kibiko Hashem Tzulam. The Yud creates Elam Haba. The Hey is the source of Elam Hazeh. Now the question begs, which Hey are we talking about when we say Kibiko Hashem Tzulam? Here the Alter Rebbe jumps to Abba Yosef Brato, which is the Hey Tato, the lower Hey of Shem Hashem, which is associated with the Malchus. Malchus Kolei Lomim. But when you say Kibiko Hashem Tzulam, it's the Yud Kei, the first Hey, which, as we said many times, it's Bina, and Bina is part of the Chabad, the intellect, which is kind of the opposite extreme, not totally the opposite if you think about the two extremes, of course, the Yud and the Hey Tata. But here you're talking about the Hey, the supreme Hey of the Shem Hashem, is what the pasuk means when it says Kibiko Hashem Tzulam. And what Alter Rebbe is jumping down to the lower Hey. And of course, what's the connection in general with the Hey Ilah to Eilamim, to this physical world? The Yud to Elam Haba, the Alter Rebbe explained. Even though Elam Haba is about the Bina experience, but what's the source of the Bina? The Eid and the Chachma is the Nikuda which comes into the Eichal. Again, we learned 2 weeks ago, click away. So the direct connection of the Yud to Elam Haba, but the connection of Hey to Elam Hazeh, Alter Rebbe jumps to lower Hey. Okay, that makes sense. But what does the pasuk mean? The pasuk didn't mean the lower Hey, Kibiko Hashem Tzulam. The pasuk meant the higher, the superior Hey, the supreme Hey within Hashem Hashem and Hashem's holy name, which corresponds to the Bina. Bina, Elam Hazeh, no, Elam Hazeh is very much connected to the Isis, to the Dibur of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So Alter Rebbe asked this question at this very point, on a Kaviyachal, so to say. Alter Rebbe asks on himself. He says, I just explained you the whole explanation. It makes sense, the connection of Hey to Elam Hazeh. But there's a bit of mix-up over here, because Kutzur, Kibiko Hashem Tzulam is about the Hey Ilah, the supreme Hey, the first Hey of Shem Hashem. Not the lower Hey, not the lower letter, not the Vav Ki, not the Hey Tata. So here the Alter Rebbe begins with this question. Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shakil midbari. V'hinei, the next paragraph. Even though we're talking, I'm explaining you the lower Hey of the holy name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. However, our sages of blessed memory, when they explained the Kashem Tzulamim, they were talking about the Biko, the first Hey of Hashem's name. The Rebbe explains, "L'fish mekir b'reish so lo v'libchinas gilig mehel mayud hu mushba b'nimshach b'chinas hey lo sheyesh leispashtas eich v'reichav lo heiris l'bchinas bina sheispashtas haseich la'nelam b'chinas gilui v'asoga b'archavas hadas b'archavas hadas." We should go on a bit. Ashba also mistayam is belev, and as the Alter Rebbe is going to say, mishom yetza have a makir legilui agufa isis hadibur. Let's try to translate it, but before we translate, let's try to say this orally. The Alter Rebbe says, of course, make no mistake, because Shem Tzadilam is referring to the first hay. But the Alter Rebbe explains here that the whole reason of the ability from the Yud to come down to the Brato, to that level, and to that extent of expansion, the Yud, the Chochmah Shebenefesh, should ultimately manifest in this multiplicity, or the koyach of multiplicity, which exists inherently in letters and words and so on, associated with the hey meitzes hapeh, and so on, which produce the guf and the chaymer of the Asius. How is it from something so nukudidik, if you will, so subtle like Chochmah, to ultimately come into that level of expansion? And the answer is because of the first hay. The hay law is the first idea, phenomenon of expansion. And because the hay law expands the yud, that's the koyach which ultimately allows the hay tata to establish this expansion associated with a multitude of letters, which create multitude of creations, which is of course the creation of Elam Hazeh in its entirety, in its totality. And not only it's the image of expansion from a Nakuda, but in the end of the day, that expansion is what ignites the heart, and the heart is going to follow suit with letters, like we just said, words and letters, like we just explained. How crucial the Asius, the words, as a lavush over this which you're emoting with your heart. And the heart's information comes from not necessarily the Chochmah, which is just a Nakuda flash, as we explained in the very beginning of this chapter, and earlier so many times, starting from Pei Gimel in Likutei Amorim, the first segment, click away. How the Chochmah is just a Barak HaMavrik. That not necessarily allows things to happen, even the heart to ignite. It's just about the expansion of the Bina, which allows the heart to appreciate the information and ignite in any way it is based on the information that it appreciates cognitively, with its cognitive with the cognitive faculty, in other words, the information based on the cognitive faculty which feeds to the heart, in order the heart should ignite based on the information which is receiving from the Chochmah, but namely the Bina, because the Chochmah is just a Nekuda, like we say, it's just a flash, not necessarily has the ability to ignite the heart, to feel and emote in a certain way based on the information where the person perceived. What does do that? It's the Bina, because you're able to thoroughly take apart and analyze and elaborate and dissect the matter. You understand it thoroughly, so that feeds that information, whatever you're understanding and appreciating, into your heart, which eventually will lead to the actual talking, to the execution of this which you so desire or are motivated to, if it's compassion, kindness, discipline, and so on. So the Alter Rebbe says two ideas why the direct connection between the Hey Tata and the Hey Love. For that matter, they have the same image. Because the difference of the Yud and the Yud is a Nekuda, the Hey is about expansiveness. The Vav is a straight line, also the number 6, corresponding to the 6 Midas. The final Hey is also about an expansive letter. Hey is the most expansive letter in the entire Aleph base. Because you have, first of all, the direct connection of the Hey. And again, that's the reason why they're both the Hey, because they have something so in common. It's taking the Nekuda and expanding the Nekuda, like we mentioned the other day when we started learning this very Pedic, the appreciation of the neshamas and Gan Eden, where they're neni miziv Shechina, they derive pleasure and delight from the ray of the Shechina. That's all about a bina experience, because if you don't understand something thoroughly, you can't appreciate it. You can't extract delight and inner pleasure from it if you don't fully understand and appreciate it. If it's not elaborated and dissected, and even again in this very physical world, it's the same idea. Where does a person have pleasure? Of course, there's something very sharp, very acutely appreciated in association with the Chokhmah dynamic and Chokhmah experience, that Barak HaMavik, that clarity, that flash. But in the end of the day, Tainug, pleasure and delight, is when you appreciate something, when the matter is dissected, elaborated on, and expanded. You understand it in detail, to the breadth and the width and the depth of it. Then, there's a gishmak, there's a delight. That's why it says that the atik is atika, is in dafkin bina atik, associated with tainug, as it's explained in Zer and Chassidus. It's of course it's in bina. That's the reason why, namely, El Mabah is about bina, but Alter Rebbe explains why kibika, why the yud, because the whole bina comes from that energy of chachma. It's the nekuda b'heichala, the nekuda in the expansiveness of the chamber. So the bina and the malchus have a direct connection, because here it's taking the nekuda of the chachma and expanding into bina. That gives later the ability to the Isis to expand, number one. Number two, it's just there's the direct connection as well, because the heart, the experience of the six midas don't develop, and they don't come out to expression and to fruition if you don't understand something thoroughly. As an example, someone has a drive to something, call it ava, love. And again, there's different levels when you talk about love. But the common denominator with love, you're driven to something. Why are you driven to that? Because you understand with your cognitive faculties that this is something which is going to bring you benefit. If it's a program, if it's an idea, you elaborate on it, you start understanding it thoroughly, and the more you understand it, and the more you're able to dissect, and the more you're able to appreciate how this is going to contribute, if it's to your livelihood or your stability anyway, the more you're driven to it. So where does the drive come from? From that nekuda of chokhmah? No, it's too brief. Brief on all different levels. It's only when there's expansiveness of that nekuda, which comes into the heichala, meaning to say, from the chokhmah to the bina, I understand it, I appreciate it, I see it, I see how beneficial it could be. That ignites the heart to be driven to it. And when the heart is ignited, how do you execute that drive? Is by doing something about it, talking to somebody. Can I have it? Can I buy it from you? Which again, the contribution of words, thought, speech, and action ultimately, but words becoming so centralistic in executing that midah, that drive to that program which you understood with your seichel. So the Alter Rebbe says that, of course, I'm talking about the hey, which the connection to the hey tata is which the Olam Haza was created. Even though in the pasuk it says Kibiko Hashem Tzurulam, I'm referring to the first hey, to the bina. But the Alter Rebbe says, what's bina? Bina is about expansiveness. Bina is taking the Nekud of Chachma and expanding it. The expansiveness comes from, it starts from bina and eventually ends up in Malchus, the two Heys, which is the letter within the Yud Kei Vav Kei, the four letters of Hashem's holy name. It's the most expansive letters. Expansiveness. So it's not something which is alien and so different, the Hey Tata and the Hey La, even though, of course, they're on two different levels. Very distinct and very distant if you talk about the difference of Bina, which is the inner faculties of the human being, as the Alter Rebbe himself explains in Perik Yud Tes and L'Kutei Amorim and Chaf and L'Kutei Amorim, the inner workings of man and the Isis, and it's two separate expressions. And for that matter, in the very beginning of Tanya, Perik Gimel and Perik Daled, one speaks about the inner workings of man, and then Daled begins about the Levushim, the garments. Despite the Alter Rebbe explains how essential these garments are, like garments are essential to man's expression, as conventionally and universally accepted, and it changes the image. Famous Rabbi Yechanan of his garments brought him the certain honor and a certain pride and a certain glory. That's what garments do, even though they're external, but they contribute to the whole presentation and presence of the person. So, of course, on one hand, they're levushim, machshava dibur ma'aseh, but how, especially when it comes to Avodas Hashem, the way truly we execute our inner workings towards the Kodesh Baruch Hu is precisely through levushim. For that matter, that Perik Dalet, to click away, Kuti Amor, the levushim from a certain perspective and point of view, because that's the way we're able to execute our Avodas Hashem, precisely through thought, speech, and action, not through our appreciation of the godly reality. Even our love to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, yes, it's a mitzvah to love HaKadosh Baruch Hu, but where is in what manner does a person actually able to serve or execute a service to HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Is precisely through the three garments, thought, speech, and action. So he learns Torah, does his mitzvahs. And therefore, the Alter Rebbe, from a certain perspective and point of view, the levushim of a yid is even greater and deeper than the inner workings of the yid, because that's the way he's able to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They're learning Hashem's Torah, learning Hashem, doing Hashem's mitzvahs. But in category, of course, the bina is all the way up there. It's before even a person starts connecting to the matter on an emotional level. It's still on the level of the of seichel. This is a cognitive faculty. So, of course, there's a great difference. But the Alter Rebbe draws the line. First of all, expansiveness. The heila, the heitata. They're very distant in level, but nonetheless, there's a connection between the two. And more so, what leads to the heitata is only bina, because the acuity of the matter, the way it's associated in the faculty of chokhmah, that doesn't ignite the heart yet. And therefore, it won't lead to the actual Isis. It's only when you have the Heilah, there you're able to eventually lead to the Heitata. Besides the common denominator between the expansiveness of the Heilah, the Bina, to the Heitata, to the Isis. On top of that, that's the way this is all going to happen. So that's why it's okay to say yes. Of course, Besar Ma'amoris Nivra Ha'elam associated with the Heitata, the lower Hay, which is Malchus is Peh. Asar Midvar Hashem Shamayim Nasu. Uvuruach Piv Kol Tzavom. Everything which was created with with the Isis. Again, you can see in Shaykh V'Emunah, start with the first chapter. Shaykh V'Emunah, which is the third segment, we were merited to conclude also. Click away. But nonetheless, where does it come from? Where does the beginning, where is the initiation of expansiveness comes from, establish itself? In the Heilah, the Bina, understanding a matter from the Nukud of Chokhmah. And eventually that would lead to the Isis. So it definitely a clear reconciliation between my presentation over here, says the Alter Rebbe, to the Kashem and Tzurei Lamim, which the Chazal tell us about. So let's see it inside, and we'll stop over here. So basically, we read it, but let's try to translate this, which we've just read. So the Alter Rebbe answers, because the source, again, we read the words already, but the source, so we're going to translate it with the source. And the initial step, the way something which can come from the concealment or the concealed manner of this energy, which is when it's in the Yud, in the Chokhmah, comes from the Heilah. In order that the Abba should eventually produce the Brata, the Isis, it's only because there is the Heilah which takes the Nukud of Chokhmah and expands it, like it says, Sheyesh Le'ispashtus, which the Heilah has this broad image, its width, its length, which is the image of the Hay. And it's not just like that. We spoke about this many times, namely in Shaykh V'Emunah, that the precision in Lashon HaKodesh is not, there's nothing like it in any other language, and there's no comparison at all. Every letter to its image, to its precise image, is with a maximum precision and meaning and significance, why it looks like that, why it's pronounced like that, because in Lashon HaKodesh, this is the holy tongue of HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself. It's not a Lashon Heskemi, it's rather a Lashon which has every word has meaning, every letter has meaning. So when you say in Hashem's names there's the two Hays, and you look at the Hay and you see, whoa, especially in comparison to the Yud where it's coming, where it follows, it is about broadness, expansiveness. has Ispashtus Eich V'Reichel to show, which is about the idea of Bina, which is taking the inner Seichel, the Chochma, and brings it into a state of revelation, a state of expansiveness, a state of appreciation, a state of perception, to a state of actual understanding and appreciation of the matter, Bar Chavas Hadas, in the broadness of one's knowledge. And then it comes, and only then it feeds into the heart to ignite that motivation, that sensation of the heart. Like it says in Tikkunim, Bina Liba, the connection of Bina to the heart, not Chochma. Even though, again, it's very sharp and very, very strong. The flash which we spoke about, Chochmah, for that matter, is somewhat diluted when it comes to Bina, because there's something very acute, there's something very powerful, something very potent in the Chochmah, even as opposed to the Bina. But nonetheless, it's the Bina which establishes and ignites the heart. Bina liba. Uva leiv mevin. Leiv mevin, levin motes. Leiv doesn't understand. What does it mean, Bina liba uva leiv mevin? Answer, it's only because of the dissection of the Bina, that's the way, and only then the heart is ignited. And when the heart is ignited, then you have, consequently, when a person has a motivation, has a drive, he has a love, consequently, the words which expresses this love, or this kindness, or this compassion, would follow suit. Which are ultimately manifest. This is where the source of the body of the letters of speech come from and are revealed through the 5 instruments, which is again the 5 hey meitzis we spoke about, from the helam of the yud, all the way coming from that abba yosad brato, and eventually the evolution till it comes into Asius. Now, I'm wondering if we should just finish this piece over here. Let's see if we can just finish to get to the other paragraph. And he says, this is again the similarity. There's 2 heys in the Shem Hashem. Also the hey tata, the lower hey, also has that broadness, which indicates an HaKadosh Baruch Hu's malchus kolilam, Hashem's kingdom, Hashem's reign is throughout all the Eilamis, which is also about Ispashtus, expansiveness of Hashem's reign. Malchus Chamalchus Kalalam, Lamaila, Lamata, on high and below, Ladalit Siritin, the 4 sides of Ispashtus and Mishachas Maisi is Dvar Hashem, which come from the letters of the words of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like it says in Kehelis, Kasha Dvar Melech Shiltin. Actually, this is the passage we were looking for. Dvar Melech Shiltin, the king governs and dominates, and the dominion of a king comes from his speech, as we understand and appreciate it on every single level. Therefore you see the direct correlation of the lower hay to the higher hay. So of course the Chachamim, when they said Kibikash to explain the pasuk Kashim Tzurei Lamim, of course they were referring to the Yud Nivra Elam Haba and the first hay Nivra Elam Hazeh. But nonetheless you see the direct connection to the hay Ilah, to the hay Tata. So when we speak about time and again this world directly connected, not so much to the Heilah, but rather to the Heitata, Asar Mamoris Nivra Elam, Masher Dvar Melech Shiltein, the Divar Hashem Shemaim Naso, V'ruach Piv Kol Tzavam, all about the Heitata, not such a contradiction to this, what the Pasuk says, and the Chazal explain the Heilah being the force and energy of Elam Hazeh, because the whole Hispashus of the Heitata comes from the Heilah, from the Supreme Hay. The Rebbe has this little brackets, and we'll stop after this brackets. Love about Mizairi, Musa Sadi Belakus, Shelik Musaguf, Nefesh Chas V'Shalom, Kwan Izbar B'Derech Tzara, Belukot Yamarim, Chali Beis, Perik Yud, Aleph Yud Beis Ayin Shom. The Rebbe says the whole phenomenon of a speech. Hold up, we're talking about Hashem, and we're giving examples the way it is by a human being. That I emote, and my speech follows suit, and I talk, and that's the way my feelings are executed, and so on. Hey, we're talking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. We have speech by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What type of talk we talk? When we talk about HaKadosh Baruch Hu, what type of speech? Hashem doesn't have the body and the soul the way it is by the human being, and all this explanation is the way we see it through the lens and the way it comes through the human being, and Hashem doesn't have any body, and Hashem doesn't have the nefesh the way the human being has the nefesh. So what does it mean that we speak about Dibur of HaKadosh Baruch Hu? He says, we explained that already. In Shaykhim Emunah, Perigud Aleph, Perigud Beis, look there, which Baruch Hashem we merited to conclude the Shaykh of Emunah, and it's all actually lined up in the original website, tanyaonline.com. You find it there. It's clearly noted, this is the 10th chapter, 11th chapter, even though there's 11th chapter, 12th chapter, that is, even though there's a few classes on each, but definitely you go there, you can glean the answer to this question, which the Alter Rebbe asks over here. In the end of the day, when Hashem says, "Asar Mamoris Nivra Olam," yes, there's Mamoris of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which the world was created, and the pasuk says, "Dvar Hashem Shemayim Nasu Uvarach Piv Kol Tzavam." Of course, there's a dibur together with the understanding and the natural appreciation that is very distinct than the talk and the speech of the human being. But nonetheless, the pasuk uses the word, the Mishnah uses the word, because there's meaning behind it, the similarity, the way it is. That's the way. That's why the Adam is Adam El Elyon. It's similar to the Elyon, to the primordial Adam, which is Kaviyachal, or rather, which is HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Not literally Adam, but that whole image. The reason why we have all the setup of the faculties the way it is by the human being is because we evolved from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Adam El Elyon. So mipsari, from my experience, we're able to appreciate things the way on high, even though, of course, on high they're so different and distinct. Have a wonderful